I'm Matt, and this is my garage. I'm shifting gears a little bit. I know I've been working on the 79, but this is the 1988 right here, and I haven't filmed a lot with this car, but I did a restoration on this. I got it all back together again, and it started, but it ran like crap. So I, was scratching my head for a little while, trying to figure out what could have gone wrong, and I think I know what it was. I'm pretty sure the cam timing is not correct, because I set this sucker for 104, 104, and that is not correct for 1988 turbo. It should be like 110 on the intake and 100 degrees on the exhaust. So I have to pull this motor out and redo the cam timing. Gonna do that today, and once I get that taken care of, get the timing right, gonna get the motor back in the car, we're gonna pressurize the system with fuel, and we're gonna check, this has the Bosch CIS injection system. Once we get it pressurized, we're gonna check the control pressure and the system pressure on the car to make sure our fuel distributor is good, our warm-up regulator is acting properly. And we're going to go a little deeper into the cold start injection, make sure that system is energizing on crank and all that's working correctly. And then finally, double check the distributor timing, the static timing. I want to make sure the wire leads are correct and that I've got #1 firing when it should be firing. So after that, we're going to put the motor back in the car and start it up, and hopefully we'll have better results. So let's get into it. All right, here's where I'm at. Got the back panel out. I like to take the rotors off and the brake pads, the calipers off when I pull the motor. Just makes it a lot easier, get a lot more clearance. I'm going to pull this though with the turbo on, and I've got the Allionx exhaust manifold on there. I'm going to try to pull it with that on. So I've got the fuel distributor out, and the whole the Bosch plenum and all that is out of there right now. So the only thing I have left to do are the motor mounts, the air conditioning lines, the oil lines right there to the oil pump down in there, and then you've got 2 coolant lines up front. One is goes into the water pump. Well, actually they both go into the water pump. You got the big one and you got the small one, and I'm not going to tackle those till I get the motor off the motor mounts on the hoist, lift it up a little bit and pulled back so I can get in there and get those off. It's a lot easier that way than trying to get them off the way they sit. So that's about it. The hatch is on. So what I'm going to do is take the shocks off the hatch, lift the hatch up to 90 degrees, and that'll give me enough to pull the motor. Exhaust is off. I've got to get that stud out of the back of the transaxle, and I also need to get the brake light switch out of there as well, because I need that clearance to get it up over the rear spoiler of the car. So that's it. I'm going to get it out, going to drop it down, go through the timing, and get it back in. I just got the AC lines off. They are, I think it was 24 millimeter for the small one and 27 millimeter for the top one. Now I got to hit those 2 oil lines right there. The motor mount down there, I got that disconnected. So I got the motor ready to come out. Funny thing is, it took me almost just as long to set up the engine hoist and the load balancer and the straps by myself as it did to disconnect the entire motor. No joke. Just as long to just get it on the hoist in the right position as it took me to disconnect everything. So back hatch is still on. Got it hanging out from the garage door. Hope nobody tries to close the garage door. I'm in trouble if they do. So yeah, it's ready. The only thing I don't have connected are the 2, like I said before, coolant hoses on the front of the motor that connect to the water pump. But as soon as I've got this thing up off the motor mounts right now, so it's just kind of hanging there. As soon as I can get it up a little farther, pull it back, I'm going to pop those hoses, get this out, and see what is going on with the timing. I also noticed my rear main seal is leaking oil, so I replaced that when I rebuilt the motor. Don't know what's going on, but I got to pop the transmission off and replace that damn seal again. It's on its way. It's happy. It's free. I had to take off the thermostat housing on the motor to get clearance on the rail that goes across on the back of the bulkhead, and I did have to take off more heat shields. I had to take off the heat shield that goes around the air pump because that one was in the way as well, and that was it. So now I'm going to put the phone down, get this out, and get it on the ground. Pretty good clearance in the front. I'm free down below. That load balancer, I've got probably, God, like 80% of the weight up front. So I've got that load balancer all the way to one side, but trying to do it without it, the transmission drops really low, so this keeps it nice and level when I'm pulling it out. All right, got to go up a little higher, and then I'll have it. All right, that's how high I had to go to get it out of the car. Not too bad. I had a jack under there as well. I was working the car up and down, independent of the motor as I needed to, so I got to lift it up to get the legs of the engine hoist under the car, and then because those lower suspension links hang down pretty low, I didn't have clearance for the motor mount legs. And then when I took the load off, they sprung up a little bit, and I could lower the car a little bit more, and I pulled it back at that height, so it worked well. Alright, so I'm just checking the timing on this. What I did was I took the motor to top dead center, and then I backed it off about 20 degrees, 90 degrees, something like that. Probably more like 90. That way I can turn the cams independent and it won't interfere with the pistons. Alright, so at this point, after I'd confirmed that the cam timing was in the general correct location, I had to roll up my sleeves and get to work on checking the precise cam timing and dialing this thing in. So step number one, right? I'm using a dial gauge to do this, and I put that on the front of the motor, and the first thing I wanted to do was find top dead center, so I pulled the spark plug, got the pistons up there, used my dial, located the dwell, found true top dead center, and set that on the wheel that was attached to my crankshaft. So after I had that, it was on to the cam timing, right? So I took the covers off both the intake and the exhaust cam housings, and loosened up the screws on the vernier, and then went ahead and I set the intake to 110 degrees. Double checked that 2 or 3 times, but got that correct. And then I set the exhaust to 100 degrees. Double checked that, so I knew that was correct. Once I was very, very comfortable with cam timing, went ahead and locked down the verniers, and my 2 timing marks on my wheels were set up right across from one another, so my timing marks are still good, which is fantastic. And now it's time to put the belt back on. Now, when I put the belt on, this is the oil pump drive here. You can see this little yellow dot. When you have the belt tightened, you want that yellow dot to sort of be right in line if you drew a line between the center of the crank and the center of the oil pump shaft. So when the belt's on, you want it like right there. And the only reason you want to do that is because of the notches that the distributor fits into. That's going to allow you to place the distributor under the manifold such that you have room to turn it with that vacuum advance. Other than that, it doesn't matter. I mean, theoretically, it could be anywhere, but the problem is that distributor can only turn so far because it gets interference with that vacuum advance. So if you set the center line, if you set that yellow dot on the pulley in line with the center line, then you're guaranteed to have enough movement to set your timing with your distributor and be able to turn that back and forth without too much interference from the vacuum on the distributor. So that's it. So now I got to get the belt on, tighten it up, make sure everything stays in position, which is kind of a pain. And when you tighten the tensioner, you want to go clockwise. So when I tighten it, I want to be going in the clockwise direction to tighten that belt. Don't go counterclockwise, it'll work against the rotation of the motor and tend to loosen itself. So always turn that thing, actually that's counterclockwise. Counterclockwise, not clockwise. Counterclockwise. So I'll be putting that belt on and turning counterclockwise. All right, let me get to work on this. All right, cam timing's done. What I found was that when you put the belt on and you tighten that tensioner counterclockwise, it tends to want to move this intake cam in a counterclockwise direction before the belt teeth engage, which causes that timing mark to slide north just a little bit. So I found that I had to back this off to about there, put the belt on, and then tension everything up, and then it popped into timing with top dead center, pretty much where it should be. And then I went ahead and I just turned the motor by hand like 3 times. It stayed true to timing, so that's good. I just need to make sure I set the tension correctly on the belt. I do have a Burroughs gauge, believe it or not. Found one on eBay years ago, really cheap, so I picked it up. It's kind of weird the way you use it. I might get the camera out and film that thing, how I'm using it. I don't know if I'm using it right or not, but when I set the tension on the gauge to what it says in the manual, it does feel right. Like if you do that test on the belt, you do the twist, right? It feels right. Feels like it's setting the right tension. But it's hard to be 100% sure when you've never seen somebody else do it. On to now the distributor timing. I'm going to pull the distributor back out and just look at the rotor. Ooh, it's tight in there, a lot of stuff. Pull it back out, take a look at where the rotor is, take a look at how my cap's set up, make sure I've got the right timing. I think it's 1342 on these motors. And looking in from the back, it's turning counterclockwise as well. So make sure I've got my wires in the right place. And then get it as close as I can before I put it back in the car. So I can feel confident when I put it back in that I don't have something majorly wrong with the timing on the motor, because that would be a drag. So I'm going to do the distributor now. Well, I had a leak in the rear main seal. I noticed there was oil on the bottom of the oil pan when I pulled the motor out, and I was trying to trace it to see where it came from, and it was a little difficult to tell, but as I looked closer, I saw a stream of oil right here. I could see it when I had the gearbox on, so I decided to take the gearbox off, take the clutch off, take the flywheel off, and sure enough, what I found was that when I installed the rear main seal and I put the housing on the rear main seal, check it out, my gasket squished out the bottom, and I didn't notice that when I put the car together, and sure enough, damn thing leaked right there. And I hate leaky motors, man. I do not want a leaky motor. And these motors are just known to leak oil. So all right, so here's what I did. Ordered a new, I didn't know what it was, but I wanted to order the parts, so I had them on hand. So I ordered a new rear main seal and a new gasket for the housing. Looks like the rear main seal is fine, thank goodness, because it's kind of a pain to press the new one in and to get it at the right depth relative to the housing. It's so big, it's so big, it's hard to get it to go in square. So I'm glad I don't have to do that. That seal looks fine to me. I don't see any leaking in this area from the seal, which is good. It's coming from underneath from the gasket, so that's a much easier fix. Now, I can't remember, there's a splash guard behind the crankshaft inside the motor. I don't remember if I put that on or not. There's a lot of guys that say, hey, you don't need it, but I'm wondering now that I have this oil leak, I wonder if that splash guard helps keep excessive oil off the back of the motor, the rear main seal, and reduces the probability of leaks right here. I don't know, I have no idea. I'm going to be curious to see if I put that splash guard back on or not. So yeah, I'm going to whip this sucker off and doggone it, have to put a new gasket on. But you know what? I'm glad I pulled the motor. And I'm able to fix these things and get everything buttoned up perfectly and get it back in the car and not have to worry about this. Here's where I'm at. I took the transfer case off because I had that leak in the rear main seal, and it was the gasket on the rear main seal housing. So I took that off and cleaned it up, replaced the gasket, got it on there square. No leaks now, so that's good. And I'm getting ready. I put a new, kind of broke that spacer washer on the end of the input shaft when I was taking the transfer case off, so I got a new little nylon washer I put on the input shaft. So this thing's going back in right now. I've got the engine up on the engine hoist, and got the transmission on a transmission jack. I don't use that thing often, but when I do need it, at times like this, it sure is handy because it lets me align that transfer case while the engine's on the hoist up in the air just right, with the angles just right, so I can just slide it right onto the motor and bolt it in without having to manhandle that thing and try to force it in. So I'm going to bolt this thing up, and that's one step closer to getting it back in the car. All right, motor's about ready to go back in the car. While I had it out, I did some little rewiring on the starter. This is a high torque starter, aftermarket starter from JE out in California. Down at the bottom, it only has 2 terminals. It's got a terminal for crank, and then a terminal that runs out to the alternator, and it's also where it gets power from the battery, the big one right there on the bottom. What it doesn't have is a 3rd terminal the stock starter has for the thermal time switch and the cold start injector on the Bosch injection system. Both of those items get a signal at crank. This right here, thermal time switch, and then right up top here, the cold start injector. They are only energized at crank. So I took those wires and I spliced them into my white and red striped crank wire that comes from the ignition. So now they should get energized whenever the key's in the crank position and de-energized when it's out of the crank position. So not exactly plug and play, but I think it's all good now. All right, I've got the motor on top dead center. I'm looking in from the back. So if I pan up, here's the back of the motor. And if I zoom in on the rotor on the distributor, you can see it's pointing to like 1 o'clock. I just need to check that with my cap now. All right, cool, motor's back in. That was, actually that went a lot easier than I thought it was gonna go. Lined up really well, just dropped right in. Wasn't too hard getting the motor mounts out of the way. That vertical coolant line, that was a pain. That always gets in the way when you pull the motor. But yeah, it's back in. I gotta get the lift strap off and then start hooking everything back up again. Motor's pretty much hooked back up, and you know what, I was surprised. I think it took me about twice as long to get the motor back in and hooked up than it did to get it out. I don't know why. I wasn't expecting that. I thought it would go in just as quickly as it came out, but apparently loosening bolts and just throwing them to the side is a lot less time consuming than finding the right bolts and having to torque everything down again. So there's one thing I have left to do though. I forgot to tension the timing belt correctly while I had it out of the car. So I'm going to jack the car up, get under there, and just tighten up the belt a little bit. And throw in this back panel, make my electrical connections up there, make my electrical connections here, hook up the distributor wires, and that's it. Oh, I put some oil back in it. I've got some coolant. I got to fill it with coolant. And I'm racking my brain. I want to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. You know that feeling like, oh crap, what bolt have I not tightened? I tried to be very methodical. Like every time I put something on, I torqued it. But in the back of my mind, I'm like, oh dear God, when I start it, what's going to leak? What's going to rattle? So it's a little nerve-wracking, but no big deal. I think I got the majority of it, if not all of it. All right, so I got this thing really close to being ready to run. So what I'm going to do is pressurize the fuel system. I've got a gauge hooked up here. I just want to, while the engine's cold, check my control pressure and my system pressure on the Bosch injection and see how I'm looking. So I'm just going to jump the fuel pump relays here. I'm just going to send ground directly to the fuel pumps. That'll energize the fuel pumps. And I'm going to watch this gauge. This is my system pressure. Now that's my control. I had the line to the warm-up regulator open, so let me try it again. All right, system pressure is at 6.5 bar. That's perfect. So now I'm going to open up this gauge to the warm-up regulator, let the fuel flow through the warm-up regulator while it's cold. I'm sitting at about 2.8 bar. So yeah, 6.5 bar on system pressure, which is perfect, right within specs of Lotus manual, and then 2.8 bar for control pressure, which is actually a little bit high. Here our atmospheric pressure is about 1080, and with that my control pressure should be a little lower than it is, but you know, it's close enough for the car to start, and I can't really test the electronics in the warm-up regulator till I run the engine, but that gives me a good idea that the mechanics inside the warm-up regulator are working properly, my fuel distributor is working properly, and my pumps are good, my filters are clean, and the right amount of pressure is getting up to the motor. So first check is positive. Most of the Bosch injection system is looking good. So now we're going to try to start this baby. I know, I left you in suspense. We didn't start the motor, but that's all right. You know, the video had gone long, so we're going to cut it there, and next time, let's start the motor and go from there. All right, see ya.